Ernie from the YLab team, and I'm happy to start our program by introducing what we do and why YLab organized NFT as Revenge Capitalism as part 2 in a 3-part series on NFTs. YLab is a unique art times tech convergence product innovation lab of National Gallery Singapore. We work with artists, technologists, startups, and the community alike to innovate for the arts and culture sector. NFTs have caused quite the stir in markets, with its underlying technology, blockchain, seen to be a foundation for a decentralized world potentially explored in our previous event. So for today's session on NFT as Revenge Capitalism, we will consider whether NFTs can address inequality in the art world, perhaps even lead to new forms of collaboration and tackle complex challenges. These are important issues, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions for the group we have assembled today. Today's session will be hosted by Kathleen Dizik, a curator at National Gallery Singapore, specializing in the history of art and technology. We will be hearing from Max Haven from Lakehead University, Chris Fassner from Tropical Futures, as well as Kenza Zuari, a curator. This group of speakers come from all corners of the world, different corners of the earth, to give you diverse points of view on the promise and perils of NFTs. A disclaimer before we start the program proper. The speakers today are not registered financial or investment advisors. All opinions here are the speakers alone. Nothing to be discussed today should be relied upon as financial investment advice. The webinar is solely for informational and educational purposes only. With that in mind, I shall now pass the time over to Kathleen, who will be your host this evening. Kathleen, please.
Thanks, Ernie, for that introduction and for the opportunity to moderate tonight's panel. As Ernie has shared, tonight's panel, NFTs as Revenge Capitalism, is the second of our 3-part series, Beyond NFTs, a series of panels that reflects upon how we write history, how we find or define value, and how we understand ourselves as being part of a public, and how these ideas may or may not be shifting in relation to the risks and opportunities that NFTs and other blockchain technologies promise. Tonight's panel takes Max Haven's concept of revenge capitalism as a lens to think through NFTs, their costs, and the opportunities they have created for artists and creatives beyond the traditional art market. We're joined by Max himself, as well as Chris Fassner, the founder of Tropical Futures, and Kenza Zuwairi, a curator, collector, and NFT art specialist. We will kick off today's discussion with a short presentation from Max, where he lays out the concept of revenge capitalism as he has articulated in his 2020 book, Revenge Capitalism, The Ghosts of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts. Writers and thinkers like Emily Reed have referenced Haven's idea of revenge capitalism in considering how the financial inclusion or democratizing narrative of NFTs is perhaps a new form of value extraction for individuals. You'll be familiar with this in the mantras often echoed about NFTs giving individual artists agency and new streams of income because of the royalty protocols that can be baked into NFTs. Tonight you'll be hearing directly from Max himself, after which Chris and Kenza will provide us short introductions into their work in Web3, and we'll have time for a Q&A and conversation after. You can participate by asking questions through the comment or chat function through our YouTube stream. You can ask questions obviously during the presentations, and we will collate them and reserve them for the Q&A after. Thank you for your patience. For the audience benefit, I will introduce Max, Chris, and Kenza before they speak. So without further ado, starting today's panel is Max Haven, a writer and teacher and Canada Research Chair in the Radical Imagination. His most recent books are Palm Oil, The Grease of Empire, published in 2022, Revenge Capitalism, The Ghosts of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and The Settling of Unpayable Debts, 2020, and Art After Money, Money After Art, Creative Strategies Against Financialization, published in 2018. Haven is editor of Vagabonds, a series of short radical books from Pluto Press. He teaches at Lakehead University, where he co-directs the Reimagining Value Action Lab Some of you in Singapore might be familiar with his work. After all, he visited us last in 2017 when he was a speaker on the Future of Art and Money panel at ArtStage Singapore. Without further ado, Max, I hand the time over to you.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here with you, and it's wonderful again to be addressing an audience in Singapore, or mostly in Singapore. I imagine people are joining from all over the world. I want to preface my comments today by saying that I'm by no means an expert on NFTs. I do have expertise in the art world based on the book that was mentioned a moment ago, Art After Money, Money After Art. And but I will say, and I have followed the development of NFTs, Web3 technologies, and blockchains closely over the years because of my interest in art and money. I am, as my presentation I think will make very clear, a skeptic, more than a skeptic, I would say, in fact, quite bearish on the idea. And maybe for those of you who want to tune out and get a coffee while I'm speaking, I'll just say that, I think that the NFT moment does offer artists new opportunities to make money that may indeed be, in some ways, demonstrably better for artists than the traditional art market. But that's like saying that, a tropical storm is better than a typhoon or hurricane. The traditional art market is so horrifying for most artists that to say that something's a little bit better doesn't actually go a long way. So what I'm going to do today in this presentation is try and go over some of the basics, building blocks that went into my book, Revenge Capitalism, which is providing, I guess, a bit of a theoretical template or discussion point for our conversation today. I'm going to first begin by talking about what capitalism is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between capitalism and art. I'm going to talk a little bit about revenge in general, and then particularly the way that I use revenge in Revenge Capitalism. I'll try and talk a little bit about how I see NFTs and revenge connected, and more specifically, the way that NFTs are connected to revenge capitalism. And I'm going to end on the point, well, if I'm so bearish on NFTs, what's my alternative? And for those of you who like the TLDR moment, too long didn't read, I basically think the alternative is a fundamental, rapid, and massive transformation of the global economic system. So something that's a little bit more dramatic than what most artists can, and those who care about artists can achieve within the span of, or at least alone. And apologies for the background noise. I had to meet you today from the University of Utrecht library, so hopefully it's not too distracting. All right. To begin, you've presumably all heard the word capitalism and studied, many of you might have studied capitalism in economics classes, political science classes, sociology classes. I have a slightly different approach to it, although my approach is generally embedded to a Marxist understanding of what capitalism is and where it comes from. I think anyone can benefit from a Marxist understanding of capitalism, even if you believe that capitalism is a good system and that it's making the world a better place. Whatever we might say about the alternatives that Marx proposed, his analysis of capitalism, as many pro-capitalist thinkers admit, is second to none, especially his analysis of the way that the system has a propensity towards crisis, and those crises and contradictions manifest in different ways. So very briefly, I think we need to speak about capitalism as fundamentally a world historically unique system where the economy and society is increasingly organized by private ownership. Private ownership of what Marx called the means of production, which is to say the productive apparatus of society, the land that grows food, the factories where things are manufactured, the mines, the social apparatus of hospitals, often, or schools. These are all in control of private owners, or are sort of given over to the welfare state, but only somewhat grudgingly by a capitalist class. One of the fundamental features of capitalism is its production of forms of artificial scarcity. Now, lack of certain resources or lack of certain things is a fact of human life in any society. But particular notions of scarcity that are as framed by mainstream economic discourse is very particular to capitalist society, because it's not simply that a good or substance is naturally missing from the world. It's that, in fact, certain forms of scarcity are created by the economic system itself, as, for instance, when Agricultural land is taken away from peasants and indigenous people who are providing for their own needs and instead put towards meeting the needs of global markets. A new form of scarcity is created in those people's lives, which means that they have to access money in order to buy the necessities of life rather than producing what they need. Capitalism, throughout its whole history, has been dominated by the creation of artificial forms of scarcity, often through rents and rent-seeking behaviors, for instance, that take housing out of the purview of public control and put it in the hands of private owners and landlords. And this, in turn, creates conditions under which rentiers and capitalist actors can benefit, whereas others have to pay the price. This form of artificial scarcity and private ownership has at its core a form of exploitation, where, like in many societies in human history, a very small minority control and benefit from the labor of a vast majority. Unlike many societies in human history, the purpose and drive of the capitalist system is to generate profit, is to generate money and more money. And the ultimate horizon of the system isn't the sustaining of even its beneficiaries, the capitalist class. It's in fact the endless regeneration and expansion of the capitalist system itself. So everything within a capitalist economy drives at expanding that capitalist economy wider, further, and more extremely. It's a fundamental sort of secular tendency within capitalist societies. This, of course, as we are recognizing to our horror, often comes at the expense of people on the planet. People who are exploited, denied the things that they need, suffer from these forms of artificial scarcity. And of course, as we're coming to realize with great horror, the planet also suffers exhaustion of resources, acidification of the ocean, the release of carbon into the atmosphere, with the knock-on effects that are catastrophic for people and other forms of life. And the fundamental thing that I think is always important to remember about capitalism, especially as we enter into a discourse around alternatives that seem to emerge within it, is that contrary to the beliefs of sort of conspiracy theorists, it's important to recognize that capitalism is not run by a kind of secretive conspiratorial elite who get together and seek to, pull the levers of power. That indeed does happen in certain places at certain times. There are certainly conspiracies of people that do exist. But as a system, and especially as a global integrated system, capitalism works through the competition between its beneficiaries. So competition between different capitalists from different nation states, for instance, the Canadian capitalist class, the American, the British, the Singaporean, etc. But also competition within nation states between different sectors, the financial sector, the tech sector, the agricultural sector. And paying attention to these contradictions illuminates for us something very important about how the system works. Now, I've been particularly interested in a process known as financialization, which has happened over the last few years, last 30 or 40 years especially, which refers to the increasing power and influence of the so-called FIRE sector, which is an acronym for finance, insurance, and real estate. At various points in capitalist history, various industries take preeminence: the industrial sector, tech sector, agricultural sector. In periods of financialization, it's the big banks, large financial institutions that dominate. And this has led to a number of different things in the last few years. One of them is massive booms within the art market, as financiers have traditionally, throughout all of capitalist history, invested in fine art as a kind of proxy and as a kind of sidebar to their other dealings. Whenever we see an increase in financial wealth, we almost always see a concomitant increase in the prices of historical works of art, but also contemporary works of art. And it's important to recall for our discussions. And then we also see a process known that's sort of spoken of as the financialization of daily life, where increasingly it's not just financiers or people with savings and investments who are embroiled in a financialized system. It's all of us. We are increasingly instructed, from the richest to the poorest in our global society, to reconfigure ourselves and reimagine ourselves as investors, applying our skills, our talents, our contacts, our communities into some leverageable assets that can benefit from it. And the transition that's worth noting is within, for instance, the field of education, where at one point you had a certain notion of, at least in welfare states, that university education was being provided to students as a way of bringing them into the public and revivifying the public, and now becomes a kind of privatized investment investment in the future, where the individual student is held responsible for taking and leveraging risks for their own personal benefit. I've mentioned already that capitalism and art have a long history, and without going into the gory details, I've also made the argument, and it's not a particularly original argument, that we only come to understand this discrete category called art with capitalism as a new ruling class in Europe enriches itself through colonialism and the exploitation of workers and begins to demand specific artifacts to aggrandize their sense of entitlement. So they begin to develop a market for painting, for sculpture, for public events like orchestral works or theater that begin to reconfigure notions of craft and artisanship around the idea of the singular artistic genius. That, though, happens at the same time as two other important phenomena. One of them is widespread alienation under capitalism. Now, many societies and many mass societies, even non-capitalist ones, suffer from alienation, which is a sense that you no longer are connected to the people around you, to the earth, to the things you produce. But under capitalism, this takes on particular characteristics, having to do with commodities and having to do with the way that people's work and life and time becomes increasingly fragmented. At the same time as that's happening, there's a parallel effect within capitalist history towards fetishism and romanticization. These are complex terms I won't go into in great detail, except to say that to the extent that we become more and more alienated by our participation within an economic system where most of our time and labor and energies are put towards the profit of others, we begin to search for antidotes within that system. And arguably art and culture, and this is an argument that's been made by scholars in the Frankfurt School quite famously, works of art and culture come to fill this void, a void that is created by the alienation of capitalist society. Let's switch gears for a moment then and talk about revenge, and then I'll speak about how I put these into dialogue. Of course, revenge is a pan-historical human drama. Almost every civilization that I've been able to study has stories of revenge, and often those stories of revenge are very foundational. That said, revenge takes very different forms in different civilizations, and I argue it takes very different forms within different economic systems and within the societies that are built around economic systems. One of the things that's important to recognize is that there's a difference between, on the one hand, the stories and narratives of revenge and the actual act of taking revenge, and a revenge fantasy. Actual acts of taking revenge are quite rare. Revenge fantasies are actually very common, and I would argue that they're actually an important part of the maturation of a human being. The idea of having been wronged and dreaming of somehow righting that wrong or taking revenge, I think it's an ugly part of our character, but something that no one can deny they've ever felt in their life. And we have evidence from almost every major cosmology and religious system that gives people tools to overcome the kind of revenge fantasies they might have. And indeed, that's very important for the good of any society. As much as we might see revenge as a pan-human drama which exists in every society, it's also important to recognize that every society is going to shape revenge differently. What Stuart Hall, drawing on Michel Foucault, called the discursive formation around revenge. How revenge is talked about and imagined is going to have different characteristics in different societies, even if they all share a fundamental recognition of something deep at the core of the human animal. A couple of the things that I think are very important about the way that revenge has been concocted within the capitalist cosmology, which has now in some ways become a global cosmology, although its origins are within the sort of racist colonial thought world of Western Europe that was spread around the world through colonialism, is that thanks perhaps to the Christian doctrine that animated it, revenge is seen as a bad thing. That's not always the case, but in certainly Christian cosmology, the idea of turning the other cheek and forgiving those who wronged one is a major theme. And as a result, we can see throughout the history of capitalism and colonialism different ways in which revenge is projected onto others. So in the case of colonialism, you often see moments where colonizers, though they're acting brutally and with incredible violence towards those whom they've colonized, begin to project onto the colonized a kind of pathological vengefulness. On the right, you have the image of the Petrolus from the Paris Commune, a working class woman who was seen to be taking revenge on the ruling class for the destruction of the Paris Commune in 1871 by burning down the city. This was a kind of fictitious character created by the bourgeois press to kind of insist that the working class could not be trusted to manage society themselves and needed to be controlled through lethal violence, it turned out. Finally, and one other point about revenge generally is that it speaks to the notion of an unpaid debt. When we swear revenge, it's to sort of even the balance books, to balance the scales, so to speak, to create a form of justice that will create a kind of zero sum in the end. So in my book, Revenge Capitalism, I try and merge these two concepts of capitalism and revenge. And to do that, I have to do something a bit tricky. As I've mentioned, the way that we imagine revenge is shaped by the system in which we're in. And my argument is that the system of capitalism has discursively shaped our notion of revenge to make us only think that revenge is something taken by individuals. And you can just think about the success of a television show like Game of Thrones or the movies of Quentin Tarantino to kind of fathom how we kind of obsess in our culture in some ways, if we can indeed say that there is our culture, some sort of global capitalist culture that's very much influenced by Western European traditions and certainly American culture. There's a kind of obsession with revenge as an individual drama. But I try and shift us in this book away from the individual and think about how do systems take revenge, and particularly how does capitalism take revenge. So within that, I think about the way that that revenge is a constant and persistent tendency within the history of capitalism. But I also try and understand it as a particular period of capitalist history, specifically the last 40 years that are coterminous with this thing I'm calling financialization, or that you might be more familiar to you with the terminology of neoliberalism. This is a period of kind of market supremacy where capitalism has ruled the globe as the only sort of major modern system after the kind of collapse of the Soviet Union and movement of China towards a more capitalist form of economy, which is debatable, but we could get into it. What I mean by tendency is to say that capitalism has never survived except through these acts of revenge that have been taken on the oppressed, on workers, on colonized people. There's a tendency within capitalism for a kind of extraordinary and surplus violence. And this can be seen certainly throughout the whole history of colonialism, where colonizers, in the name of protecting the extraction of resources and the development of profitable enterprises, have never failed to exert incredible amounts of violence, and often preemptive violence. And violence that is a kind of revenge upon the population, even though the population did nothing wrong except exist, or perhaps refuse to work at the pace or in the ways that the colonizers wished, or the ways that the bosses wished in Western Europe itself. But then I also try and think about revenge capitalism as a particular period that we're living through now. And here I want to go back to the notion of capitalism being driven by contradictions and competition between capitalists rather than conspiracy. What I'm trying to get at in the book, Revenge Capitalism, is that because we live in a world that's defined by the competition for profit by many, many, many different capitalist actors, and increasingly by all of us who are encouraged to think of ourselves as investors and small-time capitalists, it begins to create these effects which nobody intends, but have the overall sort of synthetic impact of being vengeful. And so a couple of examples. One of them is catastrophic climate change. You'd be hard pressed to find even the most villainous capitalist, cackling to themselves in their boardroom, thinking about how great it's going to be to warm the earth and, lead to the death and displacement of the poorest billion people. No one's going to come out and say that that's what they believe in, right? And they don't. They all think it's a regrettable impact, and they all feel powerless. Even the most powerful CEOs feel completely powerless in the face of this. This, I think, reveals that something emerges from the system, a kind of vengeance against the earth and its people emerges from the system and its contradictions and competitions, rather than through the particular malice of any individual. Revenge for me is the outcome rather than the intention of capitalism. It describes something that happens on a broad scale. Another example is that most of the nations around the world and most of the populations in the nations around the world are burdened by these incredible unpayable debts. By this, I mean the debts that have been leveraged by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which increasingly and catastrophically determine the life chances of billions of people around the world, orienting the political economy of their nation states towards neoliberalism, cuts to social programs, etc. I think we live in a world also where many individuals and increasingly the poorest people in the world are encumbered and ensnared by debt systems that place them under incredible burdens. You know, at least in an idealistic sense, you can go into debt in order to better your life chances. But we're seeing around the world, as the system of inequality deepens, that many people, are burdened by these incredibly heavy debts that in fact are never going to be repaid. And I've done a bunch of research in the United States, for instance, where student loans and healthcare debt are an incredibly punitive form of control and indeed punishment for the poorest people in society. And that's a trend that's playing out many places around the world. All right, let's turn in the final moments to the question of NFTs, which my colleagues on the panel will know much more about. As I said, I'm a great skeptic towards it. I believe that though certain new opportunities are opening for certain kinds of artists in the NFT marketplace, this is not actually going to solve the problems for most artists, let alone the problems for most people. First of all, I think that NFTs participate fundamentally in a process within capitalism of fabricating artificial scarcity. Ultimately, what an NFT is it's a digital system to ensure that certain digital assets are artificially scarce. And as the sort of right-click trolls point out, this is actually all else being equal with the way that energy and technology is fabricated, the things that NFTs represent can typically be replicated billions, if not infinite numbers of time without much expression of energy. However, the NFT systems introduce a kind of artificial scarcity that creates a market for these things. I don't see the creation of artificial any way liberatory or a form of human liberation in any way. I think we had decades of struggles from free and open software and experimental radical artists that tried to remove the burden of artificial scarcity from capitalism. And I don't think there's anything to be gained fundamentally from that artificial scarcity, except in the limited experience of certain individuals. I also think that NFTs typically participate in the iteration of an individualistic competitive ethos. The NFT schemes that I've been introduced to, and I'm always willing to be introduced to other ones, typically tend to empower or enrich individuals or small groups. Sometimes those individuals and small groups are people who have been traditionally disempowered, but there's nothing within capitalism that doesn't prevent one group who was once excluded or oppressed from becoming a new group that is enriched and oppressive. So I don't see that as fundamentally a project of collective liberation, which I think anyone who cares about art and creativity should be dedicated towards. Finally, I think that there's a bit of naivete in the enthusiasm for NFTs, and this is a naivete that has a long pedigree and history within capitalism. It's a naivete consistently of the nouveau riche, which is to believe that just because capitalism is now enriching some people that it traditionally disempowered and disenfranchised, does not mean that the system is in any way fundamentally changing. This has in fact happened many times throughout the history of capitalism, that the economy shifts, that the value, the kind of ephemeral values within capitalism shift, new needs, new technologies, new markets emerge, and a new group of rich people emerge to replace the old group. And often that old group is proletarianized. Sometimes they manage to marry into the new group, either literally or metaphorically, but it doesn't mean that the underlying system is going to change at all. I see in the enthusiasm for NFTs a reflection of the kinds of revenge and revenge capitalism that we've been speaking about. Nietzsche famously spoke about revenge as the way in which the oppressed satisfy themselves with a fantasy of becoming like their oppressor, rather than a more capacious fantasy of abolishing their oppressor and what was famously called the negation of the negation. They dream of becoming like the people who've oppressed and exploited them, rather than eliminating the system of oppression and exploitation. And I see that largely happening within this notion of NFTs. Sure, a few people are going to get very rich. They can live the high life. They can live like the sort of superstar artists who once were the pets of the superstar gallerists. Maybe that is being so-called democratized, but that's not necessarily a good thing for humanity, and it's not going to be a good thing for the vast majority of artists. I see the enthusiasm for NFTs as a kind of misguided retaliation for the devaluation of art. Capitalism fundamentally does devalue art and human creativity, or more specifically, it creates an incredibly steep hierarchy where the vast majority of artists and creative people are basically proletarianized and forced to work in non-creative, non-artistic fields in order to earn a living. And a very tiny minority gets elevated to this position of incredible wealth and stature. That's long been the case within the art world. And it does indeed deserve our revenge. However, that's not actually going to happen with NFTs in any significant way. It may create a new hierarchy. It may open up art markets to new buyers. It may create a different trends and tendencies, but there will be nothing in it that I think will significantly flatten that extremely steep pyramid. I see NFTs ultimately as a kind of dark side of the rhetorics of financial inclusion that have really characterized the last 30 years of financialization, which insists that the problem of the world and its increasing disparity of wealth between the rich and the poor is not the fault of capitalism and financialization. Instead, the rhetoric of financial inclusion says that it's in fact, if we had more free markets, if we had more capitalism and more financialization, if we could bank the unbanked, if we could give microfinance loans to the poor, if we could give subprime loans to the poor, then magically the market and capitalism would solve the problems it's created. I see that as basically free market dogma that has no empirical validity whatsoever, and in fact does a huge amount to compound the destructive tendencies of capitalism. And I see a lot of the enthusiasm for NFTs as a kind of dark reflection of this. It may be the case that the NFT market was not created by large investment banks or the International Monetary Fund or World Bank, and yet in a certain way, the enthusiasm for the market seems to reflect that very similar rhetoric that more capitalism is going to solve the problems that capitalism created. And so I think, to bring this to a close, what worries me and concerns me about the enthusiasm for NFTs, setting aside the technological interesting things about blockchains and the possibilities that they might provide, is that there is no actual horizon for liberation or collective liberation or social change. It may indeed be a method for some individuals to enrich themselves. Perhaps, again, as I mentioned, some people who've traditionally been excluded from the opportunity to enrich themselves. But that's not going to solve the massive problems we have on Earth. And I believe art does have a role to play in helping us think through and solve those problems. I think, of course, we need to mention the fact that at least in its current state, until proof of stake replaces proof of work, which I frankly don't think is ever going to happen, NFTs participate in a massive ecological catastrophe that is mostly disproportionately going to affect those people who probably don't even know what NFTs are, because they've been excluded from the digital economy completely. And in fact, their labor and their time goes into creating that digital economy. And here I speak of the agricultural workers, the mining workers, the manufacturing workers, who essentially on whose backs our digital infrastructures are built. I think fundamentally the NFT is an elegant answer, but it's an answer to the wrong question. The question should be, how are we going to value art in our society? And that's an important question to ask, but I think the answer that says we need digital markets to value art is the wrong answer. And indeed, it's a wrong answer because it asks the wrong question. The question that we constantly ask ourselves is like, how are artists going to get paid? But that's a secondary question. The deeper question is, how are we going to value art, artists, and creativity in our society? And what kind of economy would we need to build collectively to actually create a world where those people and those acts are actually valued? Underneath that question is a deeper question about who should be allowed to be artistic and creative. And that, I think, is connected to a much deeper question of value and how we should be using people's time. I think that question, though, requires that we ask deep and very difficult questions about the economy as a whole. And so, to be a bit of a killjoy, my alternative, I don't necessarily have one except to say that artists are exploited, alienated workers on a doomed planet. and they have to make common cause with other likewise exploited, alienated workers on a doomed planet in order to overturn the economic system and build one that values not only creativity and artists, but also life, care, relation, and the full expression of human potential for everyone. I'm sorry not to have a more sort of easy next step for you, but I think what I'm trying to get at in my work is that we need to move away from just trying to solve the micro problems that the system creates and actually figuring out how to abolish the system and replace it with a different one, and to think very practically and pragmatically about the role of arts and culture in that transition as well. Sorry for going a little long, but there's a lot to share.
Thanks so much, Max. Before I introduce our next speaker, Chris, I just wanted to create a little bit of a segue here to kind of understand also how NFTs as revenge capitalism as a panel is kind of laid itself out. Max, as you know, we've invited you because we're very excited about your ideas around revenge capitalism and how this can be an appropriate sort of apparatus for critically thinking about NFTs and the global ecology around them. And in this regard, I think that there's a couple things for our audience to keep in mind, especially given the way that discourse develops in Singapore in relation to NFTs, which is for a lot of people, a lot of crypto evangelists, if you speak to them, especially when you talk about DeFi, it was always a reaction to the 2008 global financial crisis, that there was never accountability in centralized banks and centralized institutions, and there needed to be a decentralized network by which accountability or trust could be created. We don't trust power, as in main power, centralized power, and we want to differentiate and diffuse it in a way that we can share or create more accountability in other forms of social organization. The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of people don't realize this, but the highest NFT ownership, according to finders, even the sort of researchers within the NFT space, actually happens in low-income ecologies. And a lot of them, the top 5 countries are, I think most of them are actually in Southeast Asian nations. So this obviously asks very interesting questions if the image sometimes and the discourses, and Kenza has actually come out, I think you've said this a number of times, that the NFT space is a very white dominated space. One that's seen with sort of very Western wealth and that association, but at the same time, the reality when we look at the numbers and we look at statistics is very different. The landscape is very different. So Max, thank you so much for your presentation and for really breaking down some of these complicated issues for us when we start to talk about ownership, when we start to talk about the larger issues of capitalism and the way that NFTs have spun up in relation to financialization and speculation, and how this then speaks to larger questions that we've always had about capitalism that we do actually need to solve. Now, the way that this panel has been constructed is that Max introduces this sort of concept, and we'll get to this concept again with the Q&A. The following 2 speakers, Chris and Kenza, actually work within the NFT space, but they work in a space where their projects actually call for more fair representation, and they work with artists who don't have, let's say, avenues into the traditional art market. But beyond that, and this is something that I can't speak directly to Chris or Kesna, but when we talk about the landscape of artists trying to get into, you know, first local art worlds, then regional art worlds, and then international art worlds. A lot of them have found in NFTs, especially during COVID, a jump shoot way where you don't have to go to an expensive art school, or you don't have to hang out with a specific art crowd in order to slowly climb your way into the system of first affirmation, but the system of affirmation that leads to national funding and also leads to commercial funding. So obviously this is a very complicated system. And we want to return, thanks so much for sharing your ideas and a framework actually for us to start thinking about maybe we're asking the wrong questions of NFTs when we're talking about it in a very utopic sense. And that maybe we need to think about blockchain more generally and the social organizations that come out of this, rather than thinking about the financial assets and income streams and so forth. So I'm hoping that towards the Q&A we can talk more about this. So with that, we're going to move on to Chris Fusner's presentation. So like I said to the audience, Chris and Kenza are providing us sort of case studies, but also practical and pragmatic, perspectives from their practical and pragmatic experiences of working within this space and working actually for greater representation within this space and working with communities that maybe don't have access within what we consider the traditional art world, let alone the traditional art market. So without further ado, our next speaker is Chris Fuzner. Chris Fuzner is a Filipino-American designer based primarily in Milan, Italy. He is constantly looking for new ideas, models, practice, and communication related to the tropics. He's also interested in crafting and supporting the diffusion of new narratives around the climatic and geographic space that wraps around the world and connects various ecologies and peoples. Fuzner graduated from the School of Design Strategies at Parsons School of Design. Many of you in Singapore would probably be familiar with Tropical Future because of his work with the Negantropic Fields project that was presented at National Gallery during COVID as part of the Novel Ways of Being Novels Ways program that we had here at the museum. So without further ado, Chris, over to you. Oh, Chris, I'm sorry. I don't think we can hear you just yet. Yeah, perfect. We hear you now.
How are you doing? Yeah, so I'm just going to be sharing a little bit about my work with Tropical Futures from a historical context, and then we'll touch briefly on some of the projects I've been working on related to Web3 and NFTs. And then I think maybe we'll have some free time and Kathleen will prompt me with some questions. So basically a couple years ago, started Tropical Futures as more of a commentary on like, at that point, I had felt like within the speculative design and critical design discourse, there wasn't enough imagination, or at least from what I could gather in terms of futures that surrounded the tropics, even though a lot of these sort of systemic and existential risks that we face as a people, as a globe, happens within the tropics. So yeah, it basically started with a group exhibition in Cebu, Philippines in 2016 called Sarisuki 2050. And in that sort of exhibition, we were working with friends and family, collaborators in Cebu. And we basically used, the a convenience store, sari store, mama shop, as a platform to explore different futures related to ideas of like canned air, new forms of protein, to more dystopic ones related to surveillance, and of course we have that altar there of Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah, so going back to that notion of different futures, obviously at that point it was a response to, I would say, yeah, the lack of tropical futures. That at this moment, Sino-futurism had just come out, the visual essay by Lawrence Leck. We also take inspiration from Afrofuturism with like Sun Ra, and direct response to some of the exoticization and fetishism from white Hollywood futures. And then this was also came as a tongue-in-cheek response to, at that point, I was practicing in Cebu, Philippines, as a tongue-in-cheek response towards the lack of institutional capital in speaking directly to the Philippines in terms of supporting the contemporary arts and cultural scene, and so it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek play by using Tropical Futures Institute. Also, just sort of commenting on the idea of just like I guess power dynamic using the word institute. So at this point, sure, we are thinking about we were thinking about a lot of these more systemic issues related to some of these things that might affect or are affecting the tropics. And we figured that at that point in time, there are definitely people thinking about the tropics in the same way. So, we took a very approach towards just diffusing the idea and just using the words and language within a local, regional, and now sort of pan-tropical context, in terms of trying to create language or classification around the word tropical, before, I guess, before some sort of Western Cultural Institute sort of, drops in and creates a group show at PS1 MoMA or something. And yeah, and I think within that sort of space, the name and title itself, we try to, it's an attempt to, and I think in some cases it has worked, to intervene in someone's reality, and just by using these words and doing public facing activities, whether it's on the local scale or just or a more, I guess, diffused international scale products such as like merchandise and T-shirts, um, might help influence someone else's work to think about the tropics in such a way. Um, yeah, and then and within that space too, just trying to create neologisms, and I think the idea of neotropicality or just any sort of prefix suffix related to the tropics is important, and it's great just because it might encourage us to think outside a human timescale, and perhaps into a broader timescale that might be more climatic or geologic, or I guess even from a non organic organism like a corporation or something, and trying to understand how these sort of things might operate within that context of the tropics. So yeah, I'm just gonna skip around here. Yeah, and I think with looking at that and just sort of going to jump around, and I would say speak to some of Max's points. And I think with that, like trying to think in like a scalar relationality, as this slide says, and trying to understand, because once like we're thinking in a climatic sense, we're thinking on more of a biosphere or ecosystem level, and then sort of thinking from that sort of macro zoomed out perspective. You know, as I was saying earlier, it might allow us to imagine different timescales, which then helps us situate, at least for myself, situate our practice within a more, I would, within like different, scales of interaction. So a lot of the work we had done was on the community scale, and the local scale. Like in this slide here, looking at praxis with just interacting with friends, family, and collaborators in the community in Cebu, and part of that was also just me, someone that is part Filipino, trying to integrate and participate with friends and collaborators in the scene there. So the Zine Fest was, I would say, a success. I mean, the first one was a bit rough, but the second, third, and fourth iterations of that was able to sort of galvanize a flat sort of a relationship between different creative fields, in the context of this zine / art book fair. And then below, we worked together with two other design studios to create a design conference, showcasing designers from around the country and locally, as well as around the region. Um, and I think this sort of work really framed what Tropical Futures is known for the duration of time that it was active in Cebu, which was basically from 2016 up until prior to the pandemic. So we had a good 4-year run as operating a cultural space that tried our best to create a flat programming in an island that I think is a similar situation to a lot of places around the world that doesn't have either the abundance of private or public funding to connect and support cultural practices in not only art, but design, music, and um, theater, dance, and so on. Um, so yeah, and then part of our other work as well too is we do work with a range of different artists. Kathleen was mentioning our work with for the Negentropics Field exhibition, which was with Thierry Kinunuruk and Sebastian Prado, a Thai Mexican artist duo and couple. And then we do work with Chris Ardenia in the context of, I would say our participation is very commercial with Chris in terms of interacting with the art world. We do non-commercial projects, but within localized practice, we are interfacing and we had been showing his work for the last couple of years within the hyper financialized context of the art market, which I think in our own way was important, just because there usually isn't much representation from a Southeast Asian dialogue in a lot of these art fairs. Yeah, and then some work with I guess some of our more non-public facing work, which you won't see, is like working with different startups, and called this is a talk we held at the space back in the day, and then some sort of geographic sustainability. Not going to greenwash this, but like our merch, I suppose, was our sort of bait and switch response to diffusing the idea of the tropics, and the use of the word the tropics, but also in this case some vernacular design. So speaking more towards representation and diffusion of design aesthetics that come from, I guess, local, urban or local fabrics around which we live in, as a commentary against, I would say, like globalized Swiss, in the case of graphic design at least, globalized, I guess you could say Brooklyn aesthetics, or some of these sort of commercial design sort of forms, and sort of celebrating more of local cultural exploration. Um, oh yeah, and then sometimes when we do have free time, we will just write. Unfortunately, we haven't been doing this as much, but just different concepts about the idea of water as a medium, to look into different time scale and futures, versus like, for example, this is a picture of a water dispenser in the Philippines, where you got to pay a couple pesos for some potable drinking water, and that sort of scarcity represents a certain future related to water and the distribution of water, versus maybe someone that lives like in I don't know, like Rome, where there's like potable water everywhere. Um, so I'm just going to hop into some of the. So that's a little bit of background for tropical futures, but I'm just going to just show some recent work that we did with Art Dubai. Um, so unfortunately, we're not responsible for launching any amazing NFT projects, but we have been working, I think, behind the scenes with either just helping artists through Zoom calls that are interested in the space of NFTs and crypto. Definitely do take a more a stance in terms of technological diffusion and the possibility of I guess technological leapfrog within our within sort of a human scale time scale. it's definitely an incrementalist point of view as opposed to I think some of the more macro questions that Max is asking, and I think it's it's definitely so. I think a lot of artists are not afforded the luxury to think on these sort of macro terms that no doubt is important, but the work I would say I've been doing on a very small scale, very one-on-one personal scale, with the exception of Art to Buy Digital and Art Fair Philippines, has just been more about technological education and diffusion. Um, and just to give the context of, for example, the internet as we know it, it's been around for 50 years since its inception with like DARPANET, but we only really see the sort of acceleration in technological diffusion in the last couple years. And obviously, no doubt there are externalities that produce consequences related to the diffusion of these technologies and so on and so forth. But I do believe that it does offer us to explore and offer us to even have this sort of discourse here about the potential of an alternative system within our capital, within the context of our global capitalist paradigm in the um, yeah. So this is Art to Buy Digital. This is a recent project I did with Art to Buy, and the section was based on three different tenets of one, to foster and encourage local galleries within, I shouldn't say local, but within the Art to Buy ecosystem, and then pair that with participants from, I guess, other sort of social constructions within the NFT and crypto landscape, such as artist collectives on Discords, DAOs, known as also decentralized autonomous organizations, and just ignoring that jargon, it's just you could just say it's a organization of people that are aligned, but in this case maybe connected through the use of cryptocurrency or the use of crypto economic capital to achieve its goals, as well as new media sort of galleries. And I would say within the context of new media, and just to frame NFTs, because sometimes I think there's a little bit of a distortion in terms of how diffused NFTs are. It's very much a small subset within the contemporary new media art landscape. And even incorporating some of the other spaces within the NFT landscape, gaming and collectibles, it's still a very small user base or community, and it definitely is privy to, in some cases, those that can get access to adopting this technology. However, I will say that within the context of NFTs, there are often, I would say, red herrings in terms of some of the because the use of the word decentralized, and I think sometimes people misconstrue that, and there still are hierarchical systems of power that are transplanted and amplified with NFTs and cryptocurrency, just due to the inherent network structure of the technology itself, but also some of the social constructs around it. However, it does, with any sort of new technology, there is sort of opportunities to reimagine at least participation for certain artists within within some sort of economic system that exists outside of the traditional art system, in terms of whether it's galleries or you're fighting over national grants. It does offer a different avenue, especially for new media, digital artists and creators, which historically have been I would say, one of the hardest, alongside like dance and temporal conceptual practices, one of the hardest sort of mediums to really engage and sustain practice with, especially, like who's buying a critical machine learning piece on that sort of critiquing surveillance. No one's really buying those sort of pieces. But at least with the context of some of these with cryptocurrencies and NFTs, there is sort of offered some sort of less friction in terms of this new sort of collector base or means of organization. And I think Kenza will speak more to this later. But there are obviously dystopic, utopic outcomes, especially in this sort of context of NFTs and crypto. It's still very young, and from like an age perspective, it's Bitcoin came out in 2008. With NFTs, in terms of their actual diffusion and usage, it's really maybe since 2017 when the technological standard really came out. However, yeah, sure. There, on one side, we have this sort of dystopic, hyper financial surveillance situation that is already happening in certain countries that are issuing central bank digital currencies. But on the other side, too, it does offer a different scale at which we can organize and sort of work within a sort of this capitalist system, especially on the local level. Sure, we may not be operating, local currencies that, hopefully keeps wealth within communities and tries to fend away extractive capitalism, or just using, forms of barter that might sort of prevent this sort of extractive and global capitalist, clause on local communities. However, I think within the context of NFTs and crypto, the emergence of these sort of smaller, like, I would say the term is dark forest networks or communities, because oftentimes they're not communities you can just sort of Google. You would have to kind of know where to look, but they do exist, and it's been probably one of the shining lights in terms of gathering artists and creative and people just from different disciplines in Discord servers or Telegram chat rooms where people are connecting with each other, working with each other, supporting each other in terms of providing, I guess, like in the case of crypto, like education in terms of how might an artist explore this sort of space. And I think some of these formations of groups and organizations is something that really hasn't happened before on this sort of scale. I think prior to this, a lot of art exists in a localized context of a scene, and within that scene, obviously, there's different layers. But at least within this sort of internet or digital medium, there is this opportunity to cooperate and raise money. Although through crypto economic means, it does provide glimmers or I would say glimpses into the future in terms of alternative incremental practice that artists and creatives can take and deploy. With that being said, though, for sure, there's a lot of success stories in terms of at least artists finding some sort of way around, the traditional gallery or institutional ladder in the art world. However, it's still there's still challenges. It's not a panacea. It's not if I just mint NFT, I somehow find a buyer right away. There's still the market forces in terms of getting the word out there about your project and so on and so forth. But yeah, I am positive and hopeful, I think, for the space. I think the financialization aspect of it is something that is often emphasized a lot due to the clickbait nature of it. Within the ecological context, though, these networks that a lot of the NFTs exist on are running regardless, and are going to be there with or without NFTs. And I think, obviously that's not a argument again but I will say that a lot of blockchains that do host NFTs are ready proof of stake, which is mainly like Tezos and Solana. With the context of Ethereum, where there are a lot of NFTs on there, I would say the merger it's been something that's been thought about and worked on for years already. So, no one is out there running these blockchains trying to, just keep pushing on proof of work, except perhaps like the Bitcoin, which there's no NFTs really on Bitcoin's blockchain or other networks. But so ESG, consideration is definitely something that is on the horizon. I hope it's within this year, and I think there is a possibility for it to be within this year. The other thing too is I'll just end on this point, and like Kathleen, if we do have time, prod with some other questions. But there is the idea where I guess new institutional formation with NFTs, or within like the context of cryptocurrency and some of the organizations it produces. So like Kathleen mentioned, for example, the notion of split contracts, where historically, sure, everyone, you want to make sure any secondary sale your artist is going to get that 10%, or and for those that are lucky enough to sell work on the secondary market, usually it doesn't happen. Like, people don't honor that. So, but the idea of having split contracts within the art market itself, I think, encourages transparency in a lot of different ways. Like, whether it could just be a standard practice for an artist to only allow for its work to be sold through an NFT. Like, if I'm a dancer, my performance has to be sold through an NFT, and at least there's a transparent track record of who is buying that. And then from within that, you can also think about who is part of that contract itself. And this, on the flip side too, like, institutions can start thinking about it in this way too, to promote some sort of radical transparency from organizational structures, where an exhibition might include like all its participants on a blockchain registry, and highlighting the artists to the art handlers to and it's sort of I won't go into it length, but it might allow the opportunity to produce some sort of radical transparency from an institutional level, where at least can create better and more transparent practice for some of the things we do within the context of the art market, or the public art space, the institutional space. But yeah, I'll just end it there, and let Kathleen, if you have any questions.
Yeah. No, thank you, Chris. Okay, so for our audience, we're running a little short on time, so I do want to transition to Kenza. But before we do, I just want to emphasize one thing about, Chris, thank you so much for your presentation. It actually drives home a couple of things that I think we always have to keep in mind. We can think about the larger sort of macro, bigger issues, but we also have to think about the individual communities that come out of this. And I think your presentation, by starting with what Tropical Futures was doing in Cebu, and the way you were investing in local economy and local art creative economy, is sort of important to keep in mind when, even if someone were to read your NFT, larger international platforms now, when you're working with Art Fair the Philippines or you're working with Art Dubai, that the principles from which you start are ones that grow out of that initial project. And I just want to reiterate a couple things you said before we move on to Kenza, and I want to ask you a question to keep in mind for the Q&A later. So it's very clear that what is coming out of this space from what you're saying is that there's a different avenue of funding that's instead of national or private funding, and that this is coming sometimes from the community itself organizing. And so this is interesting in relation to what Max was saying in relation to the competitiveness inherent to capitalism, because sure, there's still the impasse we have about competitiveness within different communities, but within the community itself, or different, whether we're talking about Discord channels, whether we're talking about DAOs or so forth, that there is actually a sense of sharing and a whole different way of producing resources and value distributed within a specific network. Of course, there are limits to the network, but this is one thing to keep in mind that you've clearly pulled out. So. And then the other thing you brought out is that, with that, and especially if we're talking about working in countries where there aren't resources, as you were sort of saying, institutional support or even private support, what you're sort of seeing is that this sort of self-organizing through the opportunity to make something here actually enables more diverse people to be part of the creative economy, ecology, whatever you want to call it. And then the last part that you brought up was really this question of radical transparency, or the possibility that sometimes the lack of transparency within institutional or public funds when it comes to art can be made more public in a sense. So with that comes maybe the promise of accountability. Of course, none of this sort of escapes the larger issues that Max brought up with the larger capitalist system, but also these are the realities of how do you create sort of small incremental changes in relation to communities that you are invested in and that you want to bring up. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And the question I'd like you to hold for the Q&A later is to really think about and maybe share with us a bit about how the different NFT communities from the Philippines, but also from the other countries of which that you brought together from Art Dubai, for Art Dubai, are different or have similar political projects. And because what is quite clear from what you're saying, but also from my own interviews with artists working in this space, is there's a real sense of community political ethos, where there's a very clear sense of shared agenda, shared, like a shared issue that they're trying to address and deal with, and that they're trying to come together and share resource to deal with it in some shape or form. And so I'm interested to hear, and I think the audience would also be interested to hear, is how similar are these issues across sort of the different communities that you bring together, let's say through Art Dubai, or even with you working with the local NFT community in the Philippines, right? So if you can hold that for later. So, and then add on to that is maybe, like, were you looking specifically with the Art Dubai section for collectives within the space that had a very clear political ethos? So hold that for Q&A. I'll return to you later, but we want to give Kenza time to also elaborate on her on the diversity of work that she actually does in this space and how these all interrelate with the different communities that she works with. So our next speaker is Kenza Zuwairi. She's a curator, collector, and NFT art specialist. She's part of the Cyberbat DAO, aiming at increasing the representation of artists of African descent in the NFT space, as well as in the traditional art world. She is also the community builder of the Curated Marketplace Institute and co-owns a creative agency called Local Group, based in Tunisia, through which she and her partner produce art exhibitions and publish art books and editions. Thank you so much for joining us, Kenza, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. So let me know if my screen does show up, but I think it should be okay. Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you so much for having this conversation, because I think we are not confronting kind of those very different ideas enough in the space right now. So most of the conversation that are being hosted and that we're having on those NFT conferences or events such as Art Dubai are most of the time kind of pro NFTs, and we're not really trying to get also to have those conversations where we can confront some of the skepticism that is very present in the majority of people looking at NFTs, not from inside but kind of from the outside. So I think Max did mention a lot of very important things that we need to really work on and focus on for the upcoming years. Because one of the things when I joined the NFT space, and it was back in March 2020, the very first things that came up to my mind was like, first of all, this is amazing for communities where the art scene is very small, where there is a lot of difficulty to an international audience, to export yourself as an artist, to really have your art being seen by not just the local community but also international community. And the second thought was, I really hope we do not replicate whatever is going on right now in the traditional art market, because I do have a background in traditional art, so working in the traditional art market. And so when I entered the NFT space, these were kind of the two thoughts that I had. I am based in Tunis, Tunisia. So the art scene here, I know, is very, very small, and we're having a hard time getting constructive criticism, trying to really have our artists being more professionalized and having this access to an international audience, and being able to show their work outside of Tunis, because it is kind of gate capped. We have very few galleries. It's like it's a bit of a, let's say, very closed space and community. So I really wanted to explore NFTs at the time and see what we could do for the Tunisian art scene. So yeah, I started in 2020. I entered the community and I met incredible people. One of which is Linda Dunia. She's a curator, she's an artist, she's a writer, she's many things. She's based in Dakar. She's Senegalese, Lebanese, and one of the first thing that she did was found Cyberbat. So she's the founder of Cyberbat, which in the very beginning was a curated show that took part both online and in the physical world. So she created a show with amazing artists of all of African descent on Foundation, and it had a small exhibition in Dakar as well. And when at the end, after that event, and it was back in August 2021, she started to think about turning Cyberbat into a DAO. So as Chris mentioned earlier, DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization, and you can see it as a collective. So kind of, let's say, a small community within the community that have the same, where members have the same vision and want to work towards a same goal. So Cyberbat was created that way. I think it was really organic. Like everything really was done very organically. Like we just thought it was a great idea. Linda talked to both artists who participated in the show at the time, but also other people that she's met, including myself. And that was a conversation we had in November of 2021. She said, okay, let's do a DAO. Let's start and work our own little community. And we said, yes, let's do it. So we started working on Cyberbat as a DAO. We launched a fundraiser. So one of the cool things I think of the NFT space as well is how you can mobilize a community and crowdfund projects a bit more easily than in the traditional space. So artists from the DAO provided us with artworks, and we put a price on those artworks and we sold them. So anyone who would purchase those artworks would both become then a member of Cyberbat, but as a collector. So we have like different clubs: the artist club, the collectors club, and then the core team. And that money helped us fund some projects, including our participation in Art Dubai. So we were one of the DAOs to go to Art Dubai and showcase the work of our artists. So really we wanted to start this fundraiser to explain what we want to do. And what we wanted to do was really provide help and kind of create opportunities for artists of African descent, and it didn't really matter where they were in the world. The idea was just to come together and first off show what African artists are doing, so kind of put forward the different initiatives that we're doing, and also show the art that is often overlooked. Like, you know, it's really hard to show, like to yeah, I would say to highlight the work of such communities when we know exactly how the Western world is a bit more is a bit more present in the traditional art world, but also in the digital space. So Kathleen said it earlier. There's something that I say very often is like the space right now, the NFT space is very white male dominated, but it's because it is based in the crypto sector, and crypto has been very white male dominated as well. But thanks to, I think, those little communities that are created, thanks to DAOs such as, I believe, Cyberbat, our purpose is to push for those communities, like kind of push for more representation of women, of minorities, and coming together with that same goal, that same purpose, we could also push for reform within the NFT space as well. So Cyberbat was kind of this this project that we really wanted to kick off and like start, like suggest, let's say, a safe space for this community. Our goal is to be here to guide artists who need to enter this space, or also educate on the different opportunities, how to, you know, build things, how to run projects, how to create shows, and also how to promote and give tips in even career-wise for all those artists. And you know, doing things together is always easier than doing it alone. And I think the NFT space can be very overwhelming sometimes because of that system where you need to, you know, you say, okay, I'm an artist, I have this possibility of being independent financially, but also being independent in the sense that I can choose my own project, participate in this exhibition, not this one. And I don't need a gallery, I don't need to be represented, I don't need an agent. But because you don't have that agent, because you don't have that gallery, you need also to do things yourself. And the NFT space can be overwhelming because you're constantly on social media, you're constantly promoting yourself. And I think something that we do not talk enough about is mental health in the space and how you can preserve this. So Cyberbat is also here to provide support and, I guess, help artists navigate through the space that way, and you know, being here for each other. So we have now more than 22 artists in the DAO. Funnily enough, I'm the only one who's not an artist. I'm a curator, but most of the artists in the DAO also do several other things besides. So these are some of the, I mean, all of the artists in the DAO that also participated in Art Dubai. We showcase all their work, and this slideshow is kind of a, like, I will just continue talking, but at the same time I will show some of the art of our artists. I think it's important to kind of show what they're doing and explain a little bit the aesthetic. But I think what Max said, and to me is very, very important, is that there are several issues that we're trying to not resolve at this point, but really think about and reflect on, including the environmental impact of NFTs. And Chris mentioned that right now we're moving from a proof of work to proof of stake kind of system, and that could help reduce the energy consumption, because proof of work is consuming a lot of energy, and that's how Bitcoin is being mining, for example. And Ethereum right now is working on Ethereum 2.0, using proof of stake, looking at reducing of 99% the energy consumption. And we saw a lot of new blockchains, such as the Tezos blockchain, the Polygon blockchain, trying to really be very eco-friendly. So I know that a lot of communities are working on finding solutions to those, you know, issues that we cannot overlook and we cannot pretend not being aware of. And at the same time, one of the artists in our DAO that I'm really very admiring of is Acacia. She is a photographer, and she has launched a project called Beyond the Ocean, through which she's using her NFT photography to fund research projects in the scientific field. So it's important to also look at NFTs as also ways and tools to fund projects that matters and can also help and for those causes, social causes, environment, political as well. As we've seen, for example, when the Russia and Ukraine war started, a lot of those communities in the NFT space mobilized and created Ukraine DAO. And there was a lot of funds and fundraising campaigns that were done to provide money to help either Ukrainians or the Ukraine government, or also, and Cyberbats participated in such a fundraising event where we fundraise money to help African students being stuck in Ukraine and not being able to escape at a very critical moment. So NFTs can also be used for good. It's just that we need to have those conversations. We need to confront ideas and confront kind of the our doubts and concerns and how we can make things better, because there are opportunities to really do things differently, to move on from this very capitalist society and try to find solution to not only help communities that are not seen enough and helped enough, but also trying to find better solution, even for like some countries' economies. I think the blockchain can be a very powerful tool, DeFi as well. Decentralizing things could sometimes be a solution to countries that, some issues that countries might face. But this is not my expertise. So I'm more art oriented. I think what is important is to know that NFTs it's such a broad term. It's not just art, it's also about gaming, about tokenizing things, basically. So when you talk about NFTs, you talk about so many things at the same time. We must be careful to always kind of precise what we're discussing. So to me, PFP projects, so profile pictures project, collectibles projects, are very different from NFT, what I say NFT art, which is technically even wrong. The NFT art shouldn't be even a word, because at the end, what artists are doing is digital art. NFTs are just a way of selling their art in crypto and using those platforms. But what we're seeing is digital art. What I've been showing you right now, this is all digital art, animated or static. This is all digital art, and digital art has been here for so many years. Like, it started in the 60s. So it's not something new. It's just that right now, NFTs open the door for more independence and also providing it's empowering somehow. A lot of artists have seen that they could tap into communities and audiences and find collectors way more easily and actually live off their work and live off their art. So what we want to do with that is also show that and be present around the world as much as possible. These are some of the shows that we have coming up or we've done. And the idea right now is also to focus on the things that we could do in our respective countries. So one thing that I just launched literally a week ago is a micro gallery, an NFT micro gallery in downtown in Tunis, and really in the center. With a partner, we decided to kind of start this micro gallery to educate, just to show more digital art, and also make it super accessible. It's really on a busy street. It's not open. You look at it through a window. So we want to really push for more education and just show also that, what is happening and what are the opportunities and possibilities for artists. So yeah, I mean, if you scan that QR code, you will find a lot of more things about Cyberbat, including our fundraiser, our mirror, where we kind of define our vision, define what we want to, who we are, what we want to do, and also the different projects we've taken part in and will take part in as well. But again, I think there are many issues still, both environmental speaking, but also just in terms of representation and having a more, let's say, equal and egalitarian some sort of system and environment. It is hard, even as a woman, as a Black person, as any kind, like minority wise, it is difficult, even in the NFT space, to really push for more opportunities and being more visible. But at the same time, I think it's still we still have more possibilities than in the traditional art world. And maybe through what we're doing right now with this NFT space, we're pushing for reforming both of those worlds, and really try and carefully look at all of these issues and discussing all together. So conversation like this one that we're having right now is, to me, extremely important. And thank you very much for this. I think it's extremely important that we're having these conversations, extremely important that we confront ideas again. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's really, to me, very dear. I think we're lacking those type of discussions. So if we really want to make a difference, and we really want to be careful as to not repeat or perpetuate a system, then we need to have this. So thank you so much. I will stop speaking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenza. Okay, so to the audience, I apologize. We are going to be running a little bit late today. We're going to take 10 minutes actually just for a Q&A, and then we'll wrap. But if you have to leave, we totally understand. We have your questions online, and this conversation will be recorded and available for you to refer to in the future. So I do have two specific questions. Chris, I'm going to go back to you about that question. And Kenza, if you could just hold this, if you could, I'm going to tell you each the question first. And Kenza, for you, I was hoping that you can actually tell us how the DAO actually works, because there's a lot of interest in developing DAOs in Singapore. But to be honest, for our audience, I think this is something that hasn't really developed as much, as there's a huge NFT boom here, obviously, because Metacoven's from Singapore and so forth. So if you could talk a little bit about how your DAO actually works, and how you guys share resources, and how these decision makings get made, and why a DAO would be great. So just hold that question. Now, the big question actually, Max, is for you. And one of the things of why we put this panel together was reading your book, Revenge Capitalism, and also reading some of your latest interviews in relation to NFTs, and as both Chris and Kenza have pulled from your presentation at the same time, it's very clear that the ideas that you put forward are very critical for actually thinking about what a shared political project may be, and where our ethos really needs to be when we start thinking about social organization that may come out of the blockchain. NFTs are just one symptom, sure, that we have a lot of hype around, but there's a lot of reorganizing also happening, and there's a lot of new players coming on, and there's a lot of access that wasn't before, that sure, people are riding off the hyperstition and all of this. But even with all the presentations and how we come to a sort of tension or impasse here, right, where we have the sort of macro, bigger issues that we have to deal with, and one of the largest is obviously the climate crisis that faces all of us, regardless of whether you're in the West or not, right? And then we deal with issues of inequalities and issues in relation to very specific scenes. I mean, if you are an artist in a low-income ecology, telling me to worry about the climate crisis if I can't, buy a meal tomorrow, or I can't, I can't realize this dream I always wanted to have of being acknowledged as an artist, or being able to support myself as an artist. And I'm not referring to Chris's or Kenza's projects as specifically related to this, but I'm just speculating here, right? We have these tensions, right, between these two scales. So this is one of the questions that's kind of surfaced through the chat. And Max, we have to ask you to do with the hardest question here in that sense is where do we come to a meeting place? Is this going to be collectivism at a different level where we start thinking beyond regions? Obviously there's a breakdown already where we're not talking about scenes or specific nation states. I mean, Kenza's specific reference of the DAO is not located in one specific nation state or one specific identity, but is much more regionalized and open-ended. So, maybe if you could help us along there, like theoretically, how would we start moving to a common ground? And then if you don't mind answering that first, Max, and then Chris and Kenza, we'll go back to the more specific questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge open question, and we as a global species need to do something we've never done before that will take every aspect of our intelligence and ability to communicate. I mean, the task before us is monumental, and that task is going to be monumental whether the climate crisis and the associated crises of environmental catastrophe are solved within capitalism or, as I hope, with a different system. If it's solved within capitalism, I mean, we've already seen basically the catastrophic failure of most political systems to deal with the climate crisis. We've sort of blown through every single deadline that has been put in front of us, largely because different nation states are competing against one another for a place within the global sort of rat race and doing nothing substantial to address the problem of carbon emissions and other pollutants. So I guess my feeling is that, like, I understand and I sympathize, like, most of my friends are artists and most of them are poor. And I care about them and I want them to do well. I understand that some of them will do well through NFTs. And that's nice for them. But my argument is kind of at a different level, which is to say that, like, we have huge problems to face. And I actually do believe that art and culture has an important role in solving those problems or helping us rethink and reimagine those problems. I don't understand, I've yet to be convinced, I should say, how NFTs help artists help address these global problems. And I actually think that in many ways it's a barrier because it continues to instill a high level of competitive individualism and commodity.
Thanks, Max. No, that's really important to come back to, because I think at the end of the day, you know, we can, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
did we?
Hello?
Oh, sorry. I think you just cut out there, so I might have very rudely
okay.
cut you off. I'm so very sorry. Go ahead.
I guess I'm not sure. I've yet to be convinced that NFTs and the broader sort of Web3 blockchain ecosystem actually helps move us to allow us to do things collectively that we weren't able to do with other technologies that might be more peaceful. So I guess I can totally sympathize with people's personal economic concerns, but all of us come from long lineages of people who've overcome their particular economic concerns and decided not to participate or to try and rebel against a broader economic system that makes our own individual survival somewhat meaningless within a system where, you know, like, okay, a few artists might get, you know, earn an income and not have to work at, you know, a fast food restaurant. But how does that help us in the face of the kind of monumental tasks that we're facing? Now, if that's not your concern, that makes total sense to me. I mean, I think it does have to be everyone's concern, but like, obviously I'm not asking NFTs to solve the global climate crisis. I'm just pointing out that in the scope of things that we're facing, that we might have to ask different questions.
Thank you, Max. Actually, that's really important to keep in mind, because I think this is also where even the inadequacy of my question to you and assuming the impasse is also really maybe the way around is asking a different set of questions and moving beyond the system already and saying the system is inadequate. Let's build something else and move. The question is obviously, how do you start to get there? Okay, we'll return to it. Yeah. Sorry,
maybe
go ahead,
I would
Max.
just say, like, I would be open to somebody showing me the ways that NFTs, blockchains, DAOs allow us to mobilize together in better ways. But most of what I've seen is basically small pockets of people working in economic self-defense against a system that's otherwise destroying them. But I've just yet to see something that really convinced me. But I'd be open to it. I'm not totally cynical. I'm just skeptical.
Of course. No, and I think that's actually a very healthy position to take, and I think Kenza already kind of echoed that in her comments of the need for this kind of conversation. I wish we had more time to go deeper into it, but I hope you don't mind that we'll pass. I want to get to Chris and Kenza. Kenza, if you could just explain, because this has come up a number of times in the Q&A actually from the public, explain really how a DAO, how the DAO kind of works and how the decision making and the community framework kind of works. And I apologize to the audience that we are running late, so not to keep your answer short, but if you can.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it earlier. I was trying to go fast, but then I skipped this part. Yeah, so I think I briefly mentioned it. Like it started from a common vision of really wanted to do something together, and the best way of kind of professionalizing it using the blockchain was to create a DAO. So what we did is we have a core team composed of 10 people, and that core team had as a goal to set up our common wallet. So we have a wallet for the DAO, to set up kind of the fundraiser as well, to set up all of the rules for the DAO to work. So we divided it into 3. So we have the core team, we have the artist club where our artists are part of, and so it's kind of for them, like the club is for them to focus on the opportunities and the different events we're participating in, and also making sure that for some relevant events where we want to participate in or exhibitions, they have this right to vote. So every let's say opportunity that we have or we want to set up is like needs to be validated by this artist club if it concerns them. And then we have the collectors club. So through the fundraiser, anyone who collected the work was then became part of the DAO as a collector. And same other, let's say, whenever there's something that concerns them, they will have to vote to support or not support any decisions that we want to make. So the good thing about a DAO is that it's democratic in a sense. So we really want to make decision all together. We won't be comfortable if someone says no. And until now, like it's nice, but we didn't like have this kind of interaction where someone didn't want to participate in something. Quite the opposite. We always were aligned. But this is how a DAO works. Like it's kind of I'd like to see it as a more democratic, horizontal kind of company, because in the end our goal is to create things, whether they are physical events or online or digital things. So it's like see it as a collective, as people with the same vision working towards something. And the cool thing about that is that you can do very different things, and you can organize it the way that you want. It's just that it's easier to find funding like being a DAO because you're all in it together. So I think it's a very creative way of organizing ourselves into, it's kind of like an association or again, like a company, but where you have more freedom in organizing it all together.
If you had one thing or 2 things to say to someone who was looking to set up a DAO, like what advice would you have for them so that their DAO would be more successful? This is one of the questions from actually the Q&A, the public questions. Sorry.
I think you need to listen to each other as much as possible, because you don't want to come into like dead ends or conflicts, or like you need to be careful that each steps that you take, that everyone's aligned in your DAO. Even if you're just like 3 people, it's like it doesn't matter. Then that you just need to make sure that you're not you're not jeopardizing anyone, or you're not hurting anyone in the decisions that you take. So do not rush. DAOs are not like, it's not something that you just want to do quickly, and it's really like kind of in the end you're all working together, so it's important that you listen to each other, and every next step is important. I would say just take your time and listen to each other, but there's no magic, like there's no generic advice I could take, because there are so many DAOs right now that have been created, and they all have a different purpose, and they all have a different structure. So it's just like, if you want to do a DAO, like just choose the right people and listen to them.
Thank you so much, Kenza. Okay, real rush last question. I'm so sorry for keeping everyone. Chris, you've worked with Art Dubai, you've worked with art, with the art fair in the Philippines, and you've worked with different NFT communities around the world, and you've worked with DAOs and so many different structures. Do you see a shared political ethos across them, or is there something very distinct, let's say, to different NFT local scenes? And if so, could you give us a little bit more insight into sort of maybe what the NFT local scene in the Philippines is like?
Yeah, for sure. Just want to first say that I think from a planetary scale, at least like blockchain and crypto and DAOs and some of the organizing that's happening online allows, for this sort of local village scale economy, even though it's happening on a transnational level, to sort of diffuse. And in a lot of ways, we see DAOs, almost similar to some sort of cooperative. I mean, obviously they're not like a Mondragon or anything like that, but at least this idea of this sense of mutual aid and sort of working together is diffusing in this sort of sector. I mean, it's still very fringe on when you look at the entire picture, but it is one of the I would say, like smaller community scale things that we see emerging more and more now. Whether it's like a garden cooperative or a community, some sort of shared community space, or in this case, a DAO being a shared digital space with a line sort of similar sort of alignment. And I think, like, to your question, Kathleen, I think there's a sense of mutual aid in terms of within these communities. Obviously, for the specific alignment in terms of like learning about the NFT world and supporting artists and creators from that context. And I think that is more or less what is binding a lot of these communities, is this sense of education and sort of transfer of knowledge between different community members. And the results of that manifest in a number of different ways, whether it's like an individual level in terms of someone personally being able to work in this space, or whether it's a group sort of output in the context of a shared event or objective. But I will say that's like the common thread in terms of a lot of these communities, and it's a lot more universal than I would say perhaps like a local scene where you get enmeshed in some of the scene politics itself. And I would say, like, it's this sort of like digital communities I think are brought together through that sort of common goal of understanding the space and understanding that there is heavy experimentation in this area. So there's, with that comes a lot of, I think, support from each other within the community.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thank you, Max, Kenza, and Chris, for your enlightening presentations tonight. I'm really sorry we've run out of time, because I feel we're just getting to the juicy stuff and we could have a more engaged exchange, but we'll have to find another time for that. And thank you to our audience for joining us this Sunday night or morning or afternoon, wherever you might be. Please keep a lookout for our final program as part of Beyond NFTs with NFT Asia coming up this Friday. And so with that, to give you more detail and also to close our program, I'm going to hand over to Ernie from YLab.
Thank you.
Hi all, this is Ernie from the YLab team. Thank you for joining us today, and huge thanks to all our speakers as well as the audience for spending your valuable Sunday evening or morning, wherever you're joining us from. I hope this series of presentations and conversations have given you a sense of the complexities as well as the opportunities involved. And that you'll talk to us here at the YLab team if you want to build innovations using NFTs, blockchain, or any other technology to better the arts and culture space. And so please give us your feedback by scanning the QR code or going to the link that you see here on the screen. This will help us to continue to come up with programs that will address what is of relevance to you, so that we can continue to improve and design programs for your interests. YLab plays at the intersection of art and tech to bring relevant innovations to the arts and culture sector. So your feedback is critical for us to do this better, to shape this space for exploring emerging technologies, as well as hold critical conversations like the one that we just had together. To round up this three-part series of NFTs, our last event called NFTs and the New Digital Collectivism will take place in person on 27th May at National Gallery Singapore. Featuring speakers from NFT Asia, this session cannot be missed if you want to learn how these technologies have been used by the community to build a self-sustaining collective, or how community building looks like in the Web3 space. So to stay updated on the latest YLab happenings as well, you can find us on LinkedIn via YLab at National Gallery Singapore. We are also on Discord. And with that, thank you all for your time, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye-bye.